There was a man who sat alone in a federal archive reading room in the spring of 2019, surrounded by boxes of documents that the government had almost destroyed 3 times, and he told the single archivist on duty that he was looking for proof that his grandfather had not been a murderer. What he found instead was something that shook him far more deeply than any accusation ever could. His grandfather's name was Dr. Edmund Calloway, and in 1971, Edmund Calloway was the last man alive who believed, with the full conviction of a scientist and the quiet desperation of a man running out of time, that human aging was not inevitable, that it was a disease, that it could be cured. And then, on the night of March 4th, 1971. A fire tore through his private laboratory in the hills above Pasadena, California. Everything burned. His research, his samples, his journals, his life's work spanning 3 decades. The fire was ruled accidental. The case was closed in 11 days. Nobody has fully explained why. To understand what was lost in that fire, you have to go back to the beginning, not to 1971 and not even to the years of research that preceded it. You have to go back to 1934 to a cold gray medical school in Baltimore where a 22-year-old Edmund Calloway sat in a physiology lecture and raised his hand to ask a question that his professor would later describe, in a letter unearthed decades after his death, as the most uncomfortable question I have ever been asked by a student. The question was simple. Why do we accept aging as natural when we do not accept cancer as natural? The room went quiet. The professor, a man named Dr. Harold Stith, paused for what witnesses said felt like a full minute. Then he told Edmund to see him after class. What happened in that private meeting is not recorded anywhere in any surviving document. But what we do know is that Edmund Calloway left Johns Hopkins Medical School 6 weeks later and transferred to a smaller institution in Pennsylvania. His academic file contains a single handwritten note from the registrar. It reads only, "Student departed of his own volition. Promising mind." Unconventional, that word unconventional, would follow Edmund Calloway for the rest of his life. He finished his medical degree quietly in 1937. He worked for 2 years in a general practice in rural Ohio, tending to farmers and their families, delivering babies in farmhouses during winter storms, setting broken bones at kitchen tables. People who knew him from that period remembered a man of unusual intensity, someone who listened more than he spoke, who kept notebooks in every room and filled them with a cramped, urgent handwriting that his patients sometimes glimpsed and found unsettling. Not because the words were frightening, but because there were so many of them. Because even in those years of modest country medicine, Edmund Calloway was working. He was always working. In 1939, he left Ohio. He moved to Chicago, and then to Los Angeles, and then, by 1941, to a converted warehouse space in Pasadena that he had quietly purchased with money nobody could fully account for. There were whispers in the small community of alternative researchers who knew his name that he had a private benefactor, someone with resources and a personal reason to fund research into longevity. Some said it was an aging oil executive from Texas. Some said it was a European industrialist who had fled the continent ahead of the war. Nobody ever produced a name. Edmund never spoke about it. What he produced instead was results. By 1947, Edmund Calloway had developed what he called a cellular deceleration protocol. It was not a drug in the conventional sense. It was a combination of enzymatic compounds, dietary interventions, and what he described in his private journals as electromagnetic resonance calibration, a term that meant almost nothing to mainstream medicine, but that Edmund explained in his writings with a rigor and internal consistency that later researchers, the few who saw fragments of his work, found genuinely difficult to dismiss. He had tested it on animals. The results, according to the accounts of two laboratory assistants who worked with him in the late 1940s, were extraordinary. Rats that should have died at 2 years of age were alive at 4, at 5. Their tissue samples, when examined under a microscope, showed characteristics associated with far younger animals. Their coats remained full. Their movements stayed fluid and quick. One assistant, a young woman named Frances Drury, who later became a registered nurse, and who gave an interview to a small alternative medicine newsletter in 1988, said that she remembered Edmund standing over a cage one evening, looking at a rat that was nearly 3 years old and moving with the energy of a juvenile, and he had said very quietly, more to himself than to her, "We are not supposed to stop here." She asked him what he meant. He said that the animal work was only confirmation, that the real question was whether what was happening at the cellular level in these animals could be replicated safely and sustainably in human tissue. And then he had turned to look at her with an expression she described 40 years later as something between excitement and grief. And he had said, "I believe I am the answer to that question." He had been experimenting on himself. For how long? Nobody knows. Frances Drury said she became aware of it gradually, noticing things. Edmund was 40 years old in 1952, but he looked, she said, perhaps 30. Not dramatically, not impossibly, but noticeably in a way that accumulated over time. She mentioned it once, cautiously, and he deflected with a joke about good genes and clean living. But she watched him over the years that followed, and she grew more certain, not less. By 1958, Edmund Calloway was 46 years old. His colleagues at the institutional conferences he occasionally attended, where he was regarded with a mixture of fascination and condescension, noted that he appeared younger than his stated age. Photographs from that period survive. In one, taken at a longevity symposium in San Francisco in 1959, Edmund stands among a group of researchers. He is not the youngest man in the photograph. He is, by the birth dates recorded in the conference program, the second oldest. You would not know that from looking at the image. But here is where the story becomes something more complicated than a tale of scientific genius. Because Edmund Calloway, whatever he had discovered, was not interested in becoming famous. He was not interested in publishing papers or filing patents or standing before the scientific establishment to make his case. He had tried that early on. The rejections had been swift and dismissive. One journal editor had returned his submission with a handwritten note that read simply, "This is not science." Another had written that the premise was an affront to the dignity of the biological sciences. So, Edmund had retreated. He had gone deeper into his work and further from the world. He had become, by the early 1960s, something of a ghost. His laboratory in Pasadena was known in certain circles, but never visited by anyone he did not personally invite. He communicated by letter, rarely. He published nothing. He existed at the margins of a scientific world that had long since decided he was eccentric at best and a fraud at worst. And he seemed, by all accounts, entirely at peace with that judgment, because he was not working for their approval. He was working for something else entirely. He was working against a clock that for most people cannot be beaten. In 1965, something changed. A man came to see Edmund at his laboratory. His name was Dr. Robert Vance, and he was, at that point, a rising figure in mainstream gerontology, the study of aging, at the University of California. Vance had heard about Edmund through channels he later refused to specify. He had come, he said, out of professional curiosity and personal skepticism, expecting to spend an afternoon and leave with confirmation that Edmund was precisely what the establishment believed him to be. He stayed for 3 days. What Vance saw in that laboratory he never fully described publicly. In a memoir he began writing in the 1980s and never completed, fragments of which were shared with a researcher named Martin Schell in 2003, Vance wrote that he arrived expecting theater and found instead the most disciplined and methodologically coherent private research operation I had ever encountered. He wrote that the animal evidence was not anecdotal, but documented, longitudinal, and reproducible. He wrote that the compounds Edmund had developed were sophisticated, beyond anything I had seen from institutions with 10 times his resources. And then he wrote something that Shell, who spent years trying to track down the full manuscript, said was the most haunting passage in the fragments he had read. Vance wrote that on the last evening of his visit, Edmund had shown him something. Not data, not charts, not tissue samples under glass. He had shown Vance a photograph. It was a photograph of Edmund taken in 1938, when he was 26 years old. He had placed it next to a mirror and asked Vance to compare the image in the photograph to the man standing before him in 1965, at 53 years of age. Vance wrote that he did not know what to say. He wrote that the comparison was not, as he had steeled himself to expect, the comparison of a deluded man who saw what he wished to see. He wrote that Edmund Calloway at 53 looked, in his honest estimation, perhaps 35, perhaps younger. He wrote that he drove home in silence and that he did not sleep that night. Vance never collaborated with Edmund. He never publicly supported his work. When asked about him in interviews over the following years, he was diplomatic and vague, describing Edmund as an interesting thinker working outside the mainstream. But Martin Shell, who interviewed Vance twice before the older man's death in 2007, said that whenever Edmund's name came up, something shifted in Vance's manner, something that Shell could only describe as fear, not of Edmund, but of what Edmund's existence implied. Because if Edmund Calloway had genuinely slowed his own aging, if the protocol he had developed actually worked at the level he believed it did, then the implications were not merely medical, they were not merely scientific, they were something that the established order of medicine, pharmaceutical commerce, government policy, and basic human psychology was entirely unprepared to absorb. And someone, it seems, understood that very clearly. In the years between Vance's visit and the fire of 1971, Edmund's situation became increasingly strange. He had a small circle of associates, perhaps 6 or 7 people who knew the full scope of his work. 2 of them died in the late 1960s, one of a heart attack and one in a car accident. A third moved to Canada in 1969 and refused until her own death in 2001 to discuss Edmund at all. A fourth, a laboratory technician named George Pardis, gave a single interview to a fringe publication in 1974, 3 years after the fire, in which he said only that in the months before the fire, Edmund had seemed frightened, that he had told George he believed people were watching the laboratory. That mail had gone missing, that 2 separate research samples had been tampered with in ways that could not be explained by accident. The publication was small. The interview was read by almost no one. George Pardis died in 1979. No major journalist or researcher followed up. And then there was the fire itself. March 4th, 1971, a Thursday night. Edmund was 59 years old, or should have been biologically. The fire began, according to the fire marshal's report, in the eastern storage room of the laboratory, where chemicals and biological samples were kept. The cause was listed as an electrical fault in an aging ventilation system. The fire spread quickly, fed by the chemicals stored nearby, and by the time the fire department arrived, the main research area was fully involved. The building was a total loss. Edmund was not inside. He had been in his adjacent living quarters when the fire started, and he escaped with minor burns on his right forearm and the clothing he was wearing. He stood in the cold Pasadena night and watched everything he had built over 30 years burn to nothing. The fire marshal's investigation lasted 11 days. The electrical fault theory was never seriously challenged. No accelerants were found, but the report noted that the chemical storage would have consumed any evidence of accelerants within the first minutes of the fire. No witnesses were interviewed beyond Edmund himself and one neighbor who lived a quarter-mile away. The case was closed. Edmund gave one statement to investigators. He described the fire as an accident. He did not mention the missing mail or the tampered samples. He did not mention his belief that the laboratory had been under observation. He simply described an accident and signed the statement and said nothing more. He never rebuilt. He moved to a small house in Sonoma County in Northern California. He lived there quietly for the next 14 years until his death in 1985. He was, according to his death certificate, 73 years old. The physician who attended him in his final months was a local general practitioner named Dr. Susan Whitfield, who told Edmund's grandson decades later that she had been struck, when she first met Edmund, by how difficult it was to reconcile his age with his appearance. She said that even in his final year, diminished as he was by the illness that would kill him, he had looked to her clinical eye like a man considerably younger than his stated age. She had almost asked him about it. She had decided not to. She had thought it would seem rude. After Edmund died, what little remained of his personal papers passed to his son, who had little interest in his father's work and stored the boxes in a garage in Sacramento for years. When the son died in 2003, the boxes passed to Edmund's grandson, a man named Daniel Calloway, who was a software engineer in Seattle with no scientific training and no particular connection to his grandfather's legacy. He had been told, growing up, only that his grandfather had been some kind of doctor who had done experiments. The family had not discussed it further. Daniel discovered the boxes when he came to help settle his father's estate. He opened the first one late at night, expecting old financial documents or photographs. What he found instead were fragments. Fragments of notebooks. Fragments of correspondence. A partial protocol document singed at the edges that he initially assumed was unrelated to the fire until he looked more carefully and realized it had survived not because it had escaped the fire, but because Edmund had saved it, had carried it out, had held on to it through 14 years of quiet retirement without ever, apparently, doing anything with it. Daniel spent 3 years trying to understand what he had. He consulted scientists, historians, archivists. Most of them were polite and noncommittal. A few were genuinely interested. None of them could tell him what had been in the full body of work that had burned. The fragments were suggestive but incomplete. They were like pieces of a map without enough coastline to identify the territory. He was sitting in that Federal Archive reading room in 2019 because he had found a reference in one of Edmund's surviving letters to a correspondence with a National Institutes of Health official in 1968. He had filed a Freedom of Information request. The documents he received were heavily redacted, but among them was a single internal memo written by a NE administrator in October of 1968. That referenced a meeting at which Edmund's work had been discussed. The memo was 4 paragraphs long. The first 3 were entirely blacked out. The fourth read, in full, the consensus of the committee is that the research in question, if substantiated, represents a category of scientific development for which existing regulatory and ethical frameworks are entirely insufficient. Further engagement with the researcher is not recommended at this time. Daniel sat with that memo for a long time. The single archivist watched him from across the room. She later said that he had looked like a man who had just been told something he had always suspected but had hoped was not true. He drove home that evening and called his wife and told her what he had found, and she listened. And when he was finished, she asked him what he thought it meant. He said he did not know exactly, but he said that what he kept coming back to, the thing he could not stop thinking about, was his grandfather standing in that cold Pasadena night in 1971, watching 30 years of work burn, watching it and saying nothing about what he believed had happened, signing a statement that called it an accident, and then moving to the country and living quietly for another 14 years and dying of ordinary causes in an ordinary bed in an ordinary room, having told almost no one what he knew. And Daniel said that he thought he understood why. He thought that Edmund Calloway had made a calculation, standing in that cold night watching the fire, that the world was not ready, that the forces aligned against what he had discovered were larger than one man's ability to overcome, that the kindest and safest thing he could do for himself and perhaps for the idea itself was to be quiet, to wait, to let the world catch up. The world has not caught up. Research into aging, into the mechanisms of cellular senescence, into the possibility of radically extending healthy human life has accelerated enormously in the decades since Edmund died. There are laboratories now, funded by billions of dollars, working on exactly the questions Edmund was working on alone in a converted warehouse in Pasadena with equipment that was, by any modern standard, primitive. Some of the concepts he described in the surviving fragments, the enzymatic targeting of cellular degeneration pathways, the role of electromagnetic fields in biological aging processes, have found echoes, sometimes striking echoes, in peer-reviewed papers published in the last 15 years. Whether any of this is coincidence or confirmation, nobody can say. The evidence is too fragmentary. The fire was too complete. Daniel Calloway still has the boxes. He has been approached twice by researchers asking to examine the surviving fragments. He has allowed it both times. Neither researcher has been able to tell him anything definitive. One of them, a cell biologist from a major research university who asked not to be identified, told Daniel that the partial protocol document was either the work of a genuine visionary or the most internally consistent piece of pseudoscience I have ever encountered, and that she genuinely could not determine which. She had said it, Daniel told a friend, with a look on her face that reminded him of what Francis Drury had described 4 decades earlier. When she talked about Edmund standing over that cage in the late 1940s, watching a rat that should have been old living with the energy of something young, and saying, more to himself than to anyone, we are not supposed to stop here. The fire took the proof. It took the compounds, the samples, the journals, the data accumulated over 3 decades of work that the world's scientific establishment had refused to take seriously. It took the record of what one man, alone and stubborn and perhaps genuinely extraordinary, believed he had discovered about the nature of human life, and the possibility of extending it beyond what everyone had agreed was inevitable. What the fire could not take was Edmund himself. What it could not burn was the 14 years he lived afterward, quiet and unremarkable in his country house, gardening and reading and corresponding with a handful of old friends, dying at 73 of causes his attending physician found, even then, not entirely consistent with his appearance. The case was closed in 11 days. Nobody solved it. Nobody apparently wanted to. And somewhere in a storage unit in Seattle, in cardboard boxes that smell faintly of old paper and something else, something faintly chemical and unidentifiable, a software engineer named Daniel Calloway keeps the fragments of a world that burned before anyone was willing to believe it existed, waiting for a time when someone will finally know how to read them.